All right, ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to Topic 2 in Week 4 of our American History 2 class. If you're viewing this, you should have already viewed the Populism and Interracial Politics lecture for your Topic 1. If you haven't, I would recommend starting there first, because otherwise, what we talk about today is really not going to make any sense. I'll mention again one more time before we move on. Please, if you haven't already, make sure you check that work schedule that I posted on the Moodle on our Moodle class. It should be at the very top of week 4. It gives you a very good idea of what order I recommend you complete all your tasks for this weekend. Now again, as always, we're going to start off with key terms. I referenced them towards the end of the last lesson. We're going to be looking at the white league and red shirts. You can probably guess a little bit of what kind of things they got up to. We're also going to look at the infamous Alexander Manly editorial. We're going to look at Furnifold Simmons, who again I referenced a little bit last time. We'll also look at someone named Alfred Moore Waddell, and of course, as you might guess from the title of this lesson, we're going to be looking at the Wilmington race riot in quite a bit of detail. Like I said a little bit last time, I find it very unfortunate that more people are not aware of this historical event, especially since it was in North Carolina. It actually had, I believe, a huge impact on North Carolina politics and politics throughout the South for many years afterwards. So I think it's very important we spend a bit of time talking about it today. Again, just a very quick reminder for the due dates you have this week. I already mentioned them last time on the last presentation, so I won't spend a ton of time on this now. But do remember, you have your final essay thesis statement coming up. Again, all the details are in the final essay prompt on Moodle, and your second writing assignment is coming up on the 25th. All those details can be found in the Writing Assignment 2 section, also, of course, on Moodle. Let me know if you have any questions about that. In the meantime, let's look again at the backlash to fusion with some of the stuff we talked about last week. How did specifically Riot supremacists use depictions like this one right here to affect American politics after the Civil War? Look again over the cartoons I showed you in the last slide, last PowerPoint presentation. Make sure you go over the reading that I will post to Moodle. Look again at these depictions. How exactly are they depicting African Americans? What kind of message are they trying to get across? And how is that going to influence politicians and perhaps most importantly voters when it comes time to election season? Those are the kind of questions I want you to consider when you look at things like this. Also, I obviously shouldn't have to hopefully ask this, but again, why are images like these, when you answer those questions, think about why images like these are so harmful. Not just the fact, of course, that they depict African Americans as very lazy, very stupid, all sorts of negative connotations, but how are these images going to negatively affect politics and by extension African Americans in their search for independence and equality in America? I know that was a lot, but keep those questions in mind and some of those thought processes as we go through the assignments and lessons for the rest of this week. So, first off, we'll look at some methods of suppression. They, of course, didn't just stop with posting mean-looking cartoons. White supremacists took a very active role in trying to suppress black voter participation. Paramilitary groups were one of the main ones. Does anyone watching at home know what a paramilitary group is? Around here, I'm sure a few of you have some idea. Awkward pause again. I apologize. Well, for example, some of you might have heard of this actually. Someone in my home county is actually trying to start a paramilitary group called the Home Guard to protect people's constitutional rights, Second Amendment, all those typical paramilitary group focused things. Which again, not saying that those are bad things on their own, but that's a hopefully more positive example of these types of paramilitary groups. But to put it simply, a paramilitary group is just a group that uses typically types of military training, military structure, and organization, but isn't officially tied to any country or any official standing army. These, of course, as you might have guessed, are some of the more negative and among the worst paramilitary groups we've ever seen in this country. First, you had the White League, which was formed in 1874. This was formed primarily by a group of Confederate veterans who had participated in the Colfax Massacre, which was a massacre of Native Americans. Now, why is that significant to remember, potentially? Well, it suggests, as you might guess, with remembering a little bit what we talked about with Sand Creek and Wounded Knee last week, that this is going to be a very violent group with not necessarily the most sound morals of all time. So again, these groups were very much founded in violence. The red shirts, which are more widely known, arguably, which you can see an example of the uniforms they'd often wear here, which were formed in 1875. Their slogan was that they were waving the bloody shirt. So again, thinking about their goals and some of their backgrounds, what do you think that means? Again, awkward pause for the audience at home. Yeah, as some of you might have guessed, this is typically a reference to Lost Cause ideology again. They're waving the bloody shirt of Confederate veterans who gave their lives to protect the South's independence and states' rights, from their perspective at least. So again, they're trying to call back to the Lost Cause, give their cause some kind of movement and justification. This group was formed primarily by white supremacists in Mississippi. They started wearing red shirts to make themselves visible to Republican voters. Because remember, we haven't talked about this a ton because it was a bit before the period we're talking about, but Republicans were considered to be the party of Lincoln, and as much as any politicians did at this time, were the ones who supported emancipation and black equality to an extent. So why would they want to make themselves visible to these voters? All right, yeah, you probably answered that one pretty quickly. I hope viewers at home, this one's of course about intimidation. If you show up in this with this solidarity to intimidate voters, you might scare them away from the polls completely. So again, these groups actually self-describe themselves as the military arm of the Democratic Party. So they're again showing how these groups are willing to use intimidation and violence if necessary to support the Democratic Party and to support white supremacy. And now again, before this maybe gets brought up by viewers at home, by the way, this is not, of course, the Democratic Party of today, and this is not the Republican Party of today. There have been some political ideology shifts in both parties. So I'm not saying, of course, the Republicans are this bad now, or Democrats are this good now, or anything of that nature. Just want to make sure that's clear. I do not intend this to bash Democrats or Republicans. Just showing you what the political parties were like at this time. Your opinion of politics now is really your business. I won't really get into that too much. Just want to bring that up because there's always at least one person who brings it up. You can't be too careful. Now, a couple of paramilitary practices you need to be aware of that both of these groups and others practice. First off, they would gather at voting booths. Think of your cartoons from last time. Why would they do that? All right, I'll have a very short pause for this one because I basically already answered that if you didn't figure it out from the assignment. Naturally, if you get at the voting booth to intimidate people, they might not vote in the first place. The politician you like is going to win. Riots and murders were very common. Of course, we're going to talk about one today. So again, we're not shy at all about using violence. And they would often directly force Republican politicians to resign. Why would they want to do that? Again, very short pause because, again, I basically already answered this one. The Republicans were the party of Lincoln. Get rid of Republican politicians, Democrats, and white supremacists can take their place. Also, parades and rallies were very common with these groups as well. Why would that be so important for them? And again, to maybe help to make that question make a bit more sense, I'll give you an analogy for the Nazis again. Why did the Nazis and other dictatorships do parades so often? Excuse me. Pause for the readers at home. But yeah, again, remember, they're paramilitary groups. They want to seem like actual militaries. If they participate in all these parades and rallies, makes them seem more legitimate, makes them seem more like an actual powerful and threatening military. And of course, parades all get people very nationalistic, very pumped up and excited. It can encourage more support because it looks like an actual military and not just a group of thugs. Makes them seem more legitimate, essentially. At the voting booth, there were also some more direct ways to try to disenfranchise Republican and especially black voters. There were a series of laws passed in mostly former Confederate states between 1880 and 1910 that all but disenfranchised African Americans. First, there was a poll tax. This, of course, is particularly damaging towards poor African Americans Because remember, many of them were still caught up in the sharecropping cycle at this time. Most of their money is going in to just pay off their debts and to get access to tools. Most of them can't afford to pay this poll tax. A literacy and comprehension test was also a big part of this. Now, why would that be such a barrier for African Americans at this time? Again, pause for the viewers at home. Yeah, look at the first date here, 1880. This is less than 20 years after slavery had ended, so many of these potential voters are still either former slaves, or at the very least, they're children of slaves, or the children of former slaves. And as I mentioned a little bit earlier, I believe in the semester, slaves were officially not allowed to learn to read. So many of these African Americans had never gotten the opportunity to have a formal education, so a literacy test would be very hard for them to pass. Also, non-private booths, that should be very obvious for the impact of that. If you have these groups showing up at the voting booths and they can see who you vote for, you're probably not going to vote for a politician they don't like if they're sitting there holding guns. Finally, they also use something called the grandfather clause. Is anyone familiar at home with what the grandfather clause is? As I stroke my beard academically. I think I'm funny, that's all that matters. When you're teaching by yourself, you have to entertain yourself somehow. Yeah, for those of you who are familiar with the grandfather clause, it's actually something that's used in a lot of different situations, and this one very negatively, obviously. The grandfather clause was the idea that you could get around all of these problems right here if your grandfather had legally been available to vote, or allowed to vote. Obviously, virtually none of these African Americans would have been able to pass the grandfather clause because most of their grandparents were slaves. So again, these eventually disenfranchising these African Americans while still legally saying that they had the opportunity to vote. They just weren't able to pass all the hurdles in order to do so. However, since I've been very negative on the experience of African Americans after Reconstruction and Civil War, I do want to make one thing very clear. These Jim Crow disenfranchisement laws actually hurt real gains African Americans had made in the South during Reconstruction. Why do you think it's important to remember that it hurt actual gains that had been made? Pause for the viewers at home once again. Well, for those of you who are a little bit familiar with white supremacist rhetoric, one of the common claims they would make around the civil rights era and a little bit before was the idea that African Americans were not ready for freedom and political involvement because they hadn't really accomplished anything yet and weren't capable of governing themselves, essentially. Remembering these success stories disproves that, essentially. It shows that African Americans had been capable of governing themselves and being successful. They just were not allowed to and were deliberately fought against to not allow them to do so. Very important to remember, I believe. As evidence, approximately 600 African Americans were elected to state government offices before the 1890s, and 16 actually served in Congress. An excellent example of this is someone named Robert Smalls, who you can see in this picture right here, who actually did end up serving in the U.S. Congress and lived from 1839 to 1915. If you'll take just a moment, I'd like to go ahead and play his video right now, if it'll work. Many African Americans were able to be successful after the Civil War, so it's not like they were capable of doing so, obviously. Anyway, moving on. Now I want to get a little bit more specific into what fusion politics looked like in our state. In the 1896 elections, Republican and populist voters were actually capable of gaining control of the state legislature, so the state Congress essentially, and they actually elected a Republican governor. Now, looking back on the stuff we talked about last time, why would the Democrats be so scared of this? Pause right now for the viewers at home. Yeah, you can see again in this cartoon I posted right here. Again, they're afraid of Negro rule. The Republicans and the populists were seen as being parties that supported black equality and, more importantly to them, black domination. This makes the Democrats seem like makes it seem like that's actually going to happen. Specifically, in Wilmington by 1898, a biracial coalition had actually won the offices of mayor and alderman in the state of Wilmington, or in the city of Wilmington. So, keep in mind again, do these developments change your opinion about the success of populism? Keep in mind and be prepared to answer, was populism successful? Why or why not do you think so? Probably could have worded that better, but hopefully you get the point. Now, looking a little bit more at the Alexander Manley editorial. I'm not going to go over these with you, obviously, because you're not here in person. I don't know if you've actually read this by the time you're watching this video. Hopefully you have, though. What I recommend is if you haven't watched them yet, go ahead, or read it yet, go ahead and pause it and go and read this editorial. This is one of the things that's credited with having started the Wilmington race riot. While you read it, I'm not going to make you write these down anywhere, because obviously I'm only going to give you one creative response or discussion forum assignment a week, but hint, hint, this is going to show up in future assignments, so I expect you to be prepared to discuss it. Keep in mind, or keep in mind these questions. According to Manley, how did Mrs. Felton, who wrote the article he's responding to, by the way, justify lynching? How did he argue Southern papers were reporting lynchings and rapes? According to him, how did Southern papers describe the relationship between black men and white women? Keep that one in mind particularly if you haven't noticed the significance already. Why is the relationship between black men and white women such a big issue in the South at this time? Why does he also specifically mention white men being with colored women? So keep these questions in mind. How do lynching and rapes and interracial relationships all factor into the Southern politics and these newspaper articles you're looking at? Make sure you read it thoroughly and are prepared to answer these questions. Also, when you do that, try to think of why Southerners would consider this article such a problem and a threat to their supremacy. How is it going to give Democrats an opportunity? And just look ahead a little bit. What do you think to happen to Manley? So again, like I said, if you haven't already read it, go ahead and pause it and please go read it now. If you have read it, go ahead and pause this anyway and try to answer these questions for yourself. Alright, I'm going to assume you've unpaused the video now, and we're all going to move on with our lives a little bit. Now, during the period that this editorial was posted, there was a big lead up to the riot that was obviously going to happen in Wilmington. One of the leaders was Furnifold Simmons, who was the Democratic State Party chairman in North Carolina. As you saw in the reading last week, he deliberately chose white supremacy as the theme of the Wilmington's Democratic Party's campaign. In his party platform, he stated, "North Carolina is a white man's state, and white men will rule it, and they will crush the party of Negro domination." So again, that's a big part of their rhetoric. The Republicans are the party of Negro domination. That's the angle they use to attack them. Beneath a majority so overwhelming that no other party will ever dare to attempt to establish Negro rule here. So again, they're essentially playing on these fears of Negro rule in order to get themselves back in power. The party leader, Daniel Schneck, if I'm pronouncing that correctly, stated it will be the meanest, vilest, dirtiest campaign since 1876. The slogan of the Democratic Party, "From the mountains to the sea," will be but one word. You can figure that word out for yourself, obviously. So again, I think that's very important to point out as well. This wasn't like any kind of subtle political racism. These guys were very upfront about what the goals of their political party and campaign was. For example, Alfred Moore Waddell was also a former congressman and leading orator of the white supremacy campaign. He stated in a speech leading up to the riot that the goal of their party was to redeem North Carolina from Negro domination. So again, not being subtle in the slightest. Tensions further occurred in 1898. In 1898, the Democrats were unable to take power away from the fusion government. As you might imagine, this made them even more violent. By November 9th on 1898, they posted the White Declaration of Independence, which again was formed from meetings just like the one you can see here in this newspaper article. Some of the things this called for was the disenfranchisement of black voters, the overthrow of the fusion government, give whites the majority of employment that black laborers currently had, and again, to show the importance of that editorial, Alexander Manley specifically had to be driven out of the state. Now, before I move on, why do you think they would give this document its name? Pause for the viewers at home. Yeah, again, as you can probably guess, this is something I referred to a bit on the last lesson as well. It's another attempt to call back to the Founding Fathers. It's the idea that we are supporting our founding fathers. This is what they would have wanted. We have political legitimacy as a result. So again, calling back to the founding fathers is something many politicians are going to do throughout the entire course we're going to look at, essentially. Now, the actual riot occurred the next day on November the 10th in 1898. Starting at around 7:30 a.m., there was no response from the city or the state government from the declaration, so Waddell led a militia of roughly 2,000, which you can see some of them gathered here, across the city. Some specific things they did. They vandalized and burned Alexander Manly's building. They destroyed black newspaper buildings all across the city and across the state. They dispersed throughout the city with the goal to kill, according to one of the participants, every dang N-word in sight. So again, no subtlety whatsoever. They attacked black neighborhoods, which actually, as you can see a little bit here in this photo, with a Gatling gun on the back of a wagon and several hundred shotguns, reportedly. As you might imagine, there's a very wide reports on how many people died. It is estimated anywhere between 60 to 300 potentially died in these riots. Also, they forced the mayor, the alderman, and the police chief of Wilmington at the time to all resign at gunpoint. Now, one thing I want you to take a pause for another second and think of and ask yourselves, what do you think happened to Waddell when this was all over? It's probably not what you're hoping for. I'll go ahead and tell you that. So, looking at the aftermath of the riot, I want to look at what happened to some of the participants. Furnifold Simmons. After this riot, he was a U.S. Senator for 30 more years. Alfred Waddell. After the mayor resigned, he became the new mayor of Wilmington until 1905. Rebecca Felton, who was a very outspoken lynching supporter and supporter of the riot, actually became the first female U.S. senator. She was essentially given the honor of being a senator for just a very short amount of time as a gesture of goodwill, and became an equal pay woman suffragist. Tom Jarvis, another outspoken participant, helped found East Carolina University, and there's actually still a residence hall at the university named in his honor. 4 of the riot leaders eventually became the governor of North Carolina at some point in their lives after this riot was over. In the immediate aftermath, Democrats won many elections all across the state and started to establish more harsh disenfranchisement laws and formalize Jim Crow segregation across the state. So, one thing I want to mention before we move on is, why do you think it's significant what happened to these people after the riot? Oh, there's many possible answers, obviously, but I think one of the main things I take away when I look from this is just to show how powerful and influential white supremacist politics was still at this time. Hopefully today, if any of these people participated in anything like this is so heinous, they would face enormous repercussions. Instead, many of them had many successful years and careers after the riot was over. And of course, there's a more immediate impact, which is very important for what we're going to talk about for the rest of the semester. This was showed this how white supremacy was ultimately established again all across the South. So again, now I want you to think a little bit. Why do you think students aren't taught the Wilmington Race Riot? Why do you think maybe, especially in North Carolina, we don't learn about it? And is it important for us to remember? These pauses are a little bit awkward, of course. We'll get used to it. Yeah, I think I would argue personally, and there's of course many interpretations. Let me know if you have any others. But I think it makes a lot of sense that we're not taught this about the Wilmington Race Riot, because it's not something our state's very proud of. It's not really something you want people to know when you go over your state history with them. I also believe it's important to remember this event for a few reasons. One, I think it again emphasizes what I mentioned earlier, that many African Americans were able to be successful after the Civil War. And it was ultimately only through violence that this white supremacy was reestablished in North Carolina. So again, it wasn't just some natural occurrence that was meant to happen. It was a deliberate campaign of violence that took away successes that African Americans have been able to accomplish. So again, I think that's very important to remember personally. Now, in the meantime, of course, I didn't put a final thoughts on here or final reminders slide on this one. I apologize. But just in the meantime, do remember, final essay thesis statement is coming up. By the time you're viewing this, it's probably going to be due pretty soon, so make sure you work on that if you haven't already. And of course, your second writing assignment is still coming up. Let me know if you have any questions about any of this. Thank you.